Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is AK Rex here, and this is part 2 of our interview session with Joshua Ballze. By the way, Josh, did I pronounce your surname right? Because I'm known for butchering names on this channel, so you tell me.
Ow. Ow. Yeah, no, it's Valse. It's a German origin, which it's a genealogy story that I'm not going to get into. But yeah, it's if anybody tries to pronounce it, it's as if you spelled it Vallse, so Valse. If you look at my last name on Google, you will find pictures of Goku and Vegeta because my last name is spelled close enough to Dragon Ball Z that you just start getting pictures of Dragon Ball Z after a while. So that's a fun fact.
I'm just containing my laughter so I don't overlap with your voiceover.
Yeah, these are all real facts, guys. I'm not just making this stuff up. I wish I was. I wish these were fables. They were truth. Truth.
I'm honestly grateful that you actually got into that little detail of how to pronounce it properly, because you actually sound a lot classier than I imagined, and we've been talking for a while, and yeah, apparently you're a proper classic.
Yeah. In our messages on our groups, I'm sure I come out a lot more crass. And I'm sure it doesn't help that I'm American. So I'm here to break through all those stereotypes, guys. We can be classy, adventurous paleontologists from America.
Next time you come to London, you're gonna be wearing a suit and a hat. Actually, no, not a suit and a hat. You'd be wearing a coat and a hat, and have one of those, umbrellas, long ones, black color.
Nice.
Okay, so shall we dig into it? Are you ready?
Oh, yeah.
I think our viewers are ready as well, because this time we're going to cover another... Also, well, everything here is interesting, so I think it's pointless to say that it's interesting, but it is still very interesting. It's the Paleoart and research in paleontology. So, I mean...
Yes.
I probably would start from the most, specific examples until we get into some of the more kind of miscellaneous and general stuff. So, or do you want to start from the miscellaneous and then go into very kind of notable specifics?
No, let's start off strong, just in case my little rant scared away a few viewers. So let's start strong.
Okay.
Let's get to the meat.
Alrighty then, let's get to the meat indeed. So, have you got the skin diagram, the updated skin diagram of Tyrannosaurids?
I actually have a physical... You can see it on Skype. Nobody else can, but I actually have the physical chart right here.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the one we took to Dino Fest at the Natural History Museum just this past September. And that was fun using this as an educational tool with all the diagrams and all the specific specimens and all the different Tyrannosaur specimens, and having all the citable data there for people to look up on their own was very exciting to do.
So let's talk about the, first of all, let's discuss how, because obviously we know how it came about because we were actually involved in creating it, and
yes.
You were, obviously you were the creator, the author and the artist behind this work who put it all together. So would you be kind to please give my viewers a context and background history of how this thing came to be?
Yes. So as a paleo artist, the gold standard for paleo artist, if you're actually doing a true blue scientific recreation of any animal, is finding the mummy or finding the skin or finding impressions of whatever this animal has. So it surprised me that a majority of quote unquote paleo art wasn't really clear on something as distinct as the skin impressions for an animal as famous and as hotly debated as Tyrannosaurus rex. And just as a paleo artist in general, I do a lot of research into what these animals actually look like. And as I delved more and more into the research, it just astounded me how much dinosaur skin is actually out there. It's just not widely publicized for some bizarre reason. And I think we started this project. I think we talked about this project, but we were collecting data and abstracts and papers from various people. Shout out to Paleo World. In terms of getting all of the skin that was known prior to 2017, because people want to see the chart and they think like, oh, it's very much a product of the 2017 papers, and that's absolutely incorrect. It's a product of papers that date back. Let me see what the oldest paper we have cited here. 2003 is the oldest paper that we have cited for Tyrannosaur skin. So then 2017 came around and we got the infamous and famous Bell paper. And then we got
2017.
Yes, and then we got the Carr abstract on D. Horneri. So then I started seeing just random Tyrannosaur charts, and they were actually coming out as rebuttals against these papers. And most of them just kind of addressed the Y-Rex skin. And it was interesting because the Y-Rex skin is some of the most extensive skin impressions we see for Tyrannosaurus rex proper, but at the same time, none of the other Tyrannosaur skin specimens were being addressed. It was all like, oh, well, there's tiny pieces here, and there's tiny pieces here, and a lot of this sounded like the telephone. There's something they call the telephone game, where you tell someone a story, and they tell that same story to the next person, and they tell that same story to the next person. And by the time you get to the end of the telephone line, you end up with a completely different story. And the first story that was proposed when Y-Rex skin was first publicized, which was before 2017, was a lot of the skin was the size of a coin. And then that got told down the road. And then at the end of the telephone line, the story was all of the skin was about the size of a coin.
Yeah, I was gonna say that this is where don't want to point any fingers, but there's been people quoting specific folk out there saying it's no bigger than a postcard. You know, like a very famous expression.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because the Bell et al. Paper. 2017 paper did a lot, because it was the first time, just to name one specimen, the Y-Rex specimen was suitably and correctly described. It was the first time it was described in an actual scientific paper and an actual abstract. Prior to this, it was owned by the Black Hills Institute. It is now at the Houston Museum. But yeah, I mean, when it was first publicized, we heard that there was a skin imprint on the tail, a skin imprint on the hip, and a skin imprint on somewhere around the base of the neck. And then the paper came out, and you can even look at the paper, and this isn't even hidden in the supplementary data. This is in the actual physical abstract. They have the diagram of Y-Rex, and it's like over 10 to 12 skin impressions that are peppered all over 3 of the tail vertebrae for Tyrannosaurus. So it was strange that that very significant detail was left out of the first publication via, YouTube articles and, just your usual internet articles. So there was a consistent stream of misinformation or confused information. People were getting very conflicting reports about all this Tyrannosaur skin. So finally, all of us at Paleo World, me specifically, found as a reason to just kind of get a definitive chart mapping out all of the actual Tyrannosaur skin from papers from 2003 all the way to currently 2017, which is coming to a close. Merry Christmas, anybody out there? Just in case this gets out there before or after Christmas. So, but yeah, no, that was the main purpose of the chart, was to make a definitive chart of all the citable Tyrannosaur skin. And I say citable because not too many people know this. There are two charts. There's one chart, which is the main chart, which you love or hate depending on which side of the argument you are in. And then there's the unofficial chart, which is strange because the unofficial chart shows more skin, but it's not as debated, but it is as scientifically relevant as some of these other charts that have been coming out there that don't have nearly as much research put into it. And they just are kind of just citing papers and shooting at the hip, kind of like, oh, this is relevant, and this is relevant, and this is relevant. And our chart is very disciplined in terms of, like, yes, we are counting Tyrannosaurids from the family of Tyrannosauridae, not all of the Tyrannosauroids, which include Proceratosaurids, which is, that's where animals like Eutyrannus are currently at. And that, I believe, is a paper that is, I'm rusty on the notes because I'm juggling a lot of paleo information, but I think it was either Carr or Curie that did the abstract for the reclassification of Eutyrannus, making it a Proceratosaurid. You go ahead and correct me on that.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I was gonna say that a side note on the screen is probably you're referring to the 2016 paper by Dr. Thomas Carr and
Yes.
Dr. Stephen Brussati, and they made a very nice detailed analysis of the phylogenetic position of all the taxa, and they even produced two analyses, and both of them have been, you know, extensively discussed and cited in my interview with Dr. Tom Carr, which is published on this channel. So if you haven't watched that yet, those of you, please find it in the link in the description, or just dig through my channel. It's actually fairly recent. And this is where we get a more kind of definitive, you know, update, so to speak, to the information in regards to where Eutyrannus and other related species are located. Not all of them have been allocated yet. Like, some of them are still floating about within just being basal Tyrannosauroidea, and at least I will bring it up here quickly now just to show that there's you probably heard of the Bayesian analysis from that paper, and it demonstrates that there is quite a large gap between, you know, as far as their periods go. So there is nothing in between. And it means that we don't actually even know where the split occurred between these different families, and we just have the very late period Tyrannosaurida, and we have a much earlier period Proceratosaurida, and a few earlier period as well, random Tyrannosauroidea, just basal Tyrannosauroidea, basically. That's to kind of dumb it down a little bit, so to say.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, the one thing that the Bell et al. 2017 paper did was it kind of proposed a very interesting question, which was, why did tyrannosaurs lose their filaments, their I don't want to say feathery integument, because a lot of research still needs to be done on that, but for the layman, yes, you could try to kind of shoehorn it as like, yes, downy fluff. And that was the main question. The main paper addressed that we had almost every member of Tyrannosauridae or Tyrannosaurs, proper Tyrannosaurs, and everything was showing skin. Everything was showing scales. From osteological correlates, or the hammocking that you see on the skeletal structures of these Tyrannosaur skulls, as Thomas Carr pointed out in his abstract, to Gorgosaurus, Albertosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, Daspletosaurus, the 5 or 6 Tyrannosaurs, all of them uniformly showing skin, that needed to be addressed. which is the main reason why our chart is there, and it says in very bold text, Tyrannosaur skin for the family of proper tyrannosaurs, not addressing any of these sister taxa that are far removed and are not did not contribute to the development of tyrannosaurs. And the chart is extensive on that knowledge in terms of all the particular species. We have all the particular specimens. We have all the papers cited. We worked with paleontologists, including 2 leading tyrannosaur experts. So not just paleontologists, but paleontologists that are actually tyrannosaur experts. Because a lot of people misunderstand that paleontology isn't a ballpark field. It is very much a specialized field. So it's like, you know, it's not like some of the other sciences. Not that the other sciences don't have a specialist or a specialization field, but you can go to a geologist and kind of get their general ballpark analysis on like earthquakes or meteor strikes or, you know, basic rock formations, versus you can't go to a paleontology expert on pterosaurs and get a definitive review of Tyrannosaur material. That's not how it works. With paleontology, there are very specific specialties in the field of paleontology to specific species. So we made it a point not just to include roundabout paleontologists, which were key in getting all the information and the data, which are cited in the chart, but we were also very specific in getting Tyrannosaur experts. The first person that contributed the most was Thomas Carr, and then later on we were able to get corrections and updates from Curie, which I think it's, I forget his name, is it Greg Newman?
That did Philip.
Philip. And he did no, I'm talking about the guy that did the interview with Curie. That was Greg.
His name, yes, Gregory, yes.
Yeah, so Greg did the interview with Curie, and Greg was fortunate enough to get our questions about specific material in that, and then also get verbal confirmation in terms of the size, which you know, and I know that when we released the first chart, we were still dealing with a lot of gray literature specimens, which is the unofficial chart, which is the green chart that exists out there. And stuff in that green chart is slowly being authenticated, and then in turn, once we get a paleontology review, being associated with the official chart. And the best example of this, and the most current example of this, was the Curie material, which is the material that's mentioned in his book, Dinosaur Gangs, published back in 2014. And I have a picture of it. And the crazy thing is, and you can see it and I can see it, but people listening to this won't be able to see it. This is the size of the skin, and this is the actual size of the skin in comparison to my head. And this was confirmed by Curie, because for the longest time we did not get an actual physical measurement for this skin. And it's huge. It's a huge update, but we held off on that update because we aren't in the business of making these charts for personal bias or personal vendetta. I want to go on record on saying that if we did find filaments or filament impressions for tyrannosaurs in the family Tyrannosauridae, they would have been included in the chart. The simple fact of the matter is those filaments don't exist. And we are actually finding more and more scale impressions, including that large impression update. And another thing that our chart does, which is kind of very underpublicized, is it cleared up a lot of inconsistencies with what scale impressions were what. Because for the longest time we were getting quotes of throat skin and quotes of other skin on arms and things that were being associated with different specimens. And our chart did a lot of footwork to clarify which specimens were exactly which specimens. So we actually have a definitive chart dictating which exact specimens are which with the specimen numbers. So if you were working on an abstract for a Tyrannosaur skin, you could actively get our chart and use that as a key or a codex to look down each of these specimens via their catalog numbers, which is something that I don't think any other chart really offers, or any kind of chart really out there that has existed prior, shy of an actual catalog, a museum catalog with the paleontology specimens. So yeah, and I mean our chart did a lot of things, and the motive for our chart was basically to kind of brush away a lot of the urban myths and inconsistencies and misinformation that has been cycling around Tyrannosaur skin, and kind of making a very black and white, or in this case red, look, and something that you can look at and cite, and we even get the measurements of the skin, because again, the phone call legend was all this skin collectively was the size of a coin, and just this one update with Curie is the size of my head, if not bigger. And you can get all of the measurements that we have on the chart and add it up, and I think overall it's bigger. It's more than 4 or 5 feet lined up in a row. And the only thing we haven't done is a square foot calculation. So if anybody's up to do a square foot calculation, by all means, we have the data there, go for it. But as far as the overall length of all the material, we are looking at over 5 feet of skin integument, which I think is more skin than even some other skin charts that we're currently working on. So yeah, I mean, our chart did a lot, and it took a lot of work, and we did a lot of reviews, and we got a lot of authorities to kind of sign off on it. I think the thing is, people kind of overlooked why it came out so fast, because it was so on the heels of the 2017 papers, but they don't realize that our research was actually already a year old, in terms of we were starting this research back in 2016. We just so happened to get lucky and get a lion's share of those abstracts and specimens and descriptions in 2017.
Yeah, it's a very important points you brought up here, and I wanted to address some of them in particular. That it's to basically underline the idea that one of the reasons, I think that's, to kind of maybe not exactly dumb it down, but just kind of get a bit more attention to the point that when this thoracic skin impression with Tyrannosaurus, that you got confirmation from Curie that we didn't include it originally, because we go by very strict approach, which means that if we cannot verify or test, get a positive confirmation or any way to test the claim of where the specimen comes from, and that it is indeed associated with this specific specimen or family group that we are trying to interpret, then technically, quote unquote, that knowledge should not exist. So we would be wrong by putting it there if we didn't have that confirmation. So in other words, it's kind of going into the territory when I personally see a lot of... Some of my subscribers have also asked me these questions, and lucky that Dr. Thomas Carr addressed them very nicely by basically saying that everything that is published, that you can replicate the observation, and that you can test the claim for, and peer-reviewed, of course, that knowledge can be considered valid. If it has not been published, if it has not been peer-reviewed, if it has not been documented to a degree where you can replicate the observation and test the claim, then that knowledge to science does not exist.
Yeah, and the thing is, our chart did one better, because we didn't know this. There was one specimen from Mongolia that was the Tyrannosaur skin. It was specimen MPD 1076-A, and it was reviewed in the Curie et al. 2003 paper on skin integument from Mongolia, and we actually do have that skin in the first chart. What we didn't know was that the skin in Curie's book in 2014 was the same skin. We were going under the impression that that skin, that big skin chunk, and these other smaller skin impressions, all from the thoracic region, were two separate specimens. And it wasn't until we brought this to Curie that Curie corrected us and said, no, they're both the same specimens. So that's why when you see the older and the newer chart, the two grayed out skin impressions are gone, and they're replaced with the larger skin impression from the Dino Gang's book. And that's because Curie confirmed with us that they were in fact the same skin impression. So our chart has already done a lot to course correct and clarify skin that was misidentified as other skin or considered two separate pieces of skin. And then on top of that, there was the mystery skin, because a lot of the thoracic skin, the same specimen, MPD 1076-A, was originally, we all thought, came from the throat, because we kept hearing these urban legends about skin that was from the throat. And we later were able to hunt it down to gray literature, or gray lit, which for people that don't know, gray literature can be scientific literature. In this case, it was a university book on paleontology, but it's a paper that they don't have the data. It's not susceptible to scientific analysis or review, or you cannot find those specimens to replicate those findings. Or in the case of the Montana dueling dinos and Bloody Mary, with her skin impressions, it's locked up in auction. It's locked up in auction purgatory, so you have no way to kind of actively get your hands on that data until that specimen ends up in the museum. And we were able to clarify that MPD 1076-A was in fact thoracic, in terms of it's from the lower half of the scapula, because we've been getting a lot of debates about where the skin placement is on our chart as well.
Oh yeah, I remember those times when, like, yeah, but we don't know where exactly it is. But, well,
yeah.
We never claim that we know exactly where it is. We only translate what is given in the paper. We never...
Yeah. And even then, the paper does a good job to ballpark it, but it ballparks it to a very specific area. It's not saying, well, it's on the torso, which the torso is the legs, the hip, the tail. No, the paper doesn't do that. The paper is like, no, this is on the hip, specifically in the ischium, or the ilium, which is the hip bone that is on the dorsal side, the top side of the Tyrannosaurus rex, which is the Y-Rex specimen. And that's in the paper. But for some reason, this was glazed over when a lot of people were first initially trying to take in our chart. And that was the same instance with the thoracic skin. Thoracic is from the chest to the upper scapula. So if you superimpose a skeleton onto our Tyrannosaur silhouette, you will see that the current placement for the Curie skin is from the absolute maximum of the dorsal side, and it correlates with the Albertosaurus skin, which is at the absolute maximum on the belly side, where the gastrula and the ribs are. So we can kind of say, yes, the skin has been disarticulated, but there are bone fragments associated. Curie did an abstract on this skin. Curie has cited the skin as thoracic, so ergo we have a maximum and a minimum placement for the skin, and this chart reflects that. It's an educational tool to showcase not where people wish the skin to be, but where the skin's maximum and minimum placement is on the overall animal. So at the maximum currently, we are seeing Tyrannosaur skin at the mid-abdomen, almost at the lateral line, which is where the mid and lower half of the scapula rests on the animal.
Yeah, that's very important also to note that you will... I mean, obviously you have noticed, but it's obvious to mention for the viewers as well, that if you notice how the impressions look, that they indeed are very consistent with one another, so they don't go completely far off from each other in the general resemblance. They all seem to be very consistent, which is a very good point to show that this observation tells us that this is indeed the scaly skin that we are finding in a variety of areas. They are not, you know, they are not something that people seem to frequently, wishfully or not, identify as naked skin, or the like a plucked bird skin, which obviously looks completely different, like entirely different. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm not going to be to hold back on this one, but you have to be really either so willfully ignorant, that's where Jeffrey's willful ignorance skit should come in, by the way, and you or
Does Jeffrey have a willful or ignorance skit? Because I want to see that.
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Willful ignorance.
And then there's also this part where it may be just, I don't know, maybe you just really cannot tell the difference between what you're seeing here and what you see on a, you know, on a plucked bird skin. Just completely different pattern, like nothing alike.
Yeah, no, the strangest theory that has been thrown at us that I've read has been preservation biased or selective preservation. So the theory goes that these negative skin imprints are being preserved, but the possible filaments aren't being preserved by some geological preservation process we have never heard of or have any kind of standard for. And then we have the instance of the Albertosaur skin that was found in the Horseshoe Formation up in Canada. And then we have, which is a future skin chart that we're actually going to be developing, a feathered or filament or ornithomimus. And it's in the same formation. So it's actively debunking this really bizarre theory of preservation bias by geology, because we are finding both of the skin integments in the same formation. And then even then, I think even in Mongolia, not particularly I don't know the dialect of what it's called specifically. It's like Busan Sav, but I know it's roughly translated as the Valley of the Dragon. So the Valley of the Dragon is where they're finding a lot of skin, specifically from Hadrosaurus, possibly from these Tarbosaurus specimens. So that formation, not in particular, but we are finding even Mongolian dinosaurs and maniraptors and arboreal species with feather imprints. So I think it's only a matter of time where we even find a correlation between feather preservation and these mass skin preservation processes within the same formation in Mongolia. It's slowly inching and inching closer and closer together that's what eventually we're going to find, especially because we already have a standard for it at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada. So yeah, there's a lot of strange theories being thrown out there, but there's a lot of data that debunks those theories actively. And it's as simple as just doing your homework, reading the papers, read. A lot of the things that we're finding ourselves combating is a simple solution of just sitting down and reading the material. Half the questions I got asked with the chart initially on some of the more conflicted paleontology groups was answered just as easily by just sitting down and telling them, read the chart information. And they were getting all the information they had questions to, which was, what is this? What is that? Where does it sit here? Where can I find this paper? And I'm like, oh, it's all there. All the citations are there. All the measurements are there. All the reasoning behind placement is there. It's just taking the time to read. And that's the thing that we have issues with our current generation. We have kind of an instant gratification generation. The internet has spoiled us, I want to say, in terms of getting instantaneous results at the blink of an eye. And people don't realize that science is a much longer process, and these answers come at a much slower pace. But while we're waiting for those answers, that does not give us a justification to jump to conclusions with a lot of these answers. We had the chance to jump to conclusions with this larger Tyrannosaur skin from Curie. I could have as easily thrown it on that chart and said, yes, it's officially there. And we would have almost twice as much Tyrannosaur skin because I had not combined it with the pre-existing skin from the chart. But because we took our time and our patience and got the correct, valid information and confirmation, and Curie was kind enough to give us an ear and spend some time with us to ask our questions, that we now knew the correct way to include the skin on the official Tyrannosaur chart. And as a thanks to Curie for that, Curie's name is also on the chart because Curie did actively help us with this huge, what could have been a huge mistake on our end had I chosen to act on impulse versus using the correct scientific methodologies and patience to do correct analysis before presenting it.
Yeah, I think you just brought up a very important point about not rushing into conclusions and making claims that you cannot test. Because a lot of times we find that the younger generation of today especially, and even some of the older generation, for some unknown reason, they seem to really forget this major point.
Names. No names.
No names, of course. Those who know will know, or those who suspect, well, we'll just leave them wondering. So it's just how we do it here. Sorry that I'm not sorry, but that's just how it is. And yeah, I mean, it's important, it's just underline, in all seriousness, joking aside, underlining the point that it's important to do the research and take time to, as Jeffrey likes to say, by the way, Jeffrey, I refer to the educational curator of the Dinosaur Park Museum. He is actually credited on the chart as well. And he says, read! Capital letters, uppercase, read!
No, I mean, just to plug some of the fun future stuff we have in store, some of the interviews we have lined up. Jeffrey is going to be a huge one. He's actively working on an abstract for another famous theropod, not to give too much away. And then we have another paleontologist. I think we have more than one that are lined up. So yeah, the paleo is going to flow for a while here, in all the good ways. We're going to have a lot of great interviews lined up. I feel like I've just taken a backseat as like your hype man. So stay tuned to this channel, guys. We're going to have much more paleontology.
There will be. Yeah. There will be. You're right, though. That's the thing. I mean, you're spot on. There's going to be, like, definitely, since you brought it up, I will not, I mean, it's not a secret that I'm already trying to fit in the schedule other people in the meantime as well. So it's not just going to be, obviously, paleontologists. There will be paleo artists as well, who I will be able to get in touch with and who will be able to, hopefully, and would like to also be part of this kind of session. And I mean, Tracy Lee Ford is one I'm currently negotiating with. We're just trying to find a good, convenient schedule for both of us to fit it in. Then Jeffrey Bond is credited on the chart from the curator from Dinosaur Park Museum. He's gonna be on as well. Then I actually have an idea of having you two, specifically, like to those of my Spino fans out there, by the way, viewers, that we're gonna be doing a debate between yourself and Jeffrey on Spinosaurus. So we'll stay tuned for that for the next year. And Jason Burke is also mentioned here. He's currently working on a publication, I believe, on a paper of sorts. And I can't, obviously, I don't know the details, but even if I did, I shouldn't be giving them away anyway. So I can't really...
Keep the suspense, baby. Keep the suspense.
Yes, we'll keep the suspense, exactly. And, you know, it's the science etiquette that you don't give away the information that you are not supposed to do. It's like breaking embargo is not a good thing. So, unless, of course, the author is okay with it, which, again, we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that there's going to be more paleontology. We do know that there's going to be more interesting, lovely, jubbly stuff going on this channel in the nearest future. So 2018 is going to be very exciting for this channel, I'm hoping. And to bring the next point...
Yeah. Yeah. Really quick. I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm just the paleo appetizer, baby. I'm not even the main course. I'm just here as like the nice warm up to the next big paleontology interview. Even then, I'm trying to be as tasty as I can be. So hey, hopefully somebody here likes what I'm serving. But yeah, we're gonna have some steak and some good main courses coming with the people you just mentioned, Jeffrey and Jason, because like you said, we actively worked with them as well uh, on this chart. So it also gives an insight into all the other paleontologists that were working with this. We had not just two Tyrannosaur experts, though logically that should have been enough for most people. It's not for some strange reason, but we also have additional paleontologists that worked on this chart as well from different institutions all over the world and the country. So yeah, I mean, I mean, they can give their two bits about the chart as well, just because it's a weird thing that we got to kind of keep um, defending the providence of this chart and the research of this chart. And it's one thing I was happy to do here was kind of bring to light the discipline that went into this chart. It wasn't just a chart that was thrown together on Photoshop on some random art blog. It was actually actively being used and referenced and reviewed. Our chart went through a ton of reviews before we even let it see the light of day. And it's not the last chart we're working on. I will say this is a good time to preview the next chart that we're working on that we're still actively working on it. But if we want to preview, yeah, we're the next chart we're doing is the Stegosaurus skin chart, because that's another animal people don't know that there's a lot of skin for. And it's one of many series of skins and skin charts that I think are going to be the gold standard and incredibly useful to paleo artists, because the one thing paleo artists try to do is figure out how did this animal look beyond the bones. And we have skin here showing us what kind of scales, the type of scales, the shape of scales, the scale placement on the body, which is invaluable information until we find that flux capacitor and we can go back in time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if we ever do get to bring back a Tyrannosaurus, or like, I would go for a baby so I can raise it, and then if I bring like a new girlfriend or a one night stander back home, I would just say like, hey, just babe, stay calm. It's just gonna sniff you and it will leave you alone. It's like a 12-meter thing that's basically just trying to sniff you, and then
yeah, it's good scientific practice to bring back a test subject that doesn't eat your scientist before they can study it.
Yeah.
So yeah, a baby Rex would be key.
Yeah, but then when it grows up again, it's just casually just be like, hey, it's fine. It's just gonna sniff you and then it will leave you alone. Okay, yeah, whatever. But yes, I mean, since you mentioned we've been talking about Rex, and since we have brought up the Rex, why don't we open up your black and white T-Rex portrait, and
Yes.
shall we start off with the first version, and then we will transition into updated version, which you have implemented and modified after the interview with Dr. Thomas Carr, who has reviewed your drawing. So let's open up the original first. That's what we have right now on the screen. In fact, we should have had it for several seconds on. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so this was done because as soon as I got the opportunity to do the T-Rex chart, or the Tyrannosaur chart to be more specific, then we got the chance to do, or I got the chance, or actually just the itch, the artist's itch to do a much more scientifically accurate T-Rex, which was against some of even my older art, because some of my older art is way inaccurate in comparison, because I am more or less doing an artist style versus striving for scientific accuracy. So this was one of the first goes at being scientifically accurate with Tyrannosaurus Rex after we had gotten all the information, after we got the abstract from Thomas Carr, after he had told us what we should be looking for in the face, and then the additional skin that we're looking for on the neck, which is small and pebbly. It is licorice, or what did he say?
Yeah, he did.
Twizzlers? He said
Yes,
Twizzlers, right?
yes, Twizzlers is gonna be
And
the new
I'm
thing.
starting the new Paleo war, baby. I'm all about the red vines. Sorry.
So what is it gonna be like a thing?
My brother is laughing off screen right
So it's gonna be Twizzlers versus the red wines, yeah.
This is red vines.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, to be honest, I think Dr. Carr was quite pleasantly amused at the idea that he started a new, sort of theme in the paleontology, because aside from the seriousness of science as it is, you have to bring in some humor too.
Yeah, you got to enjoy what you do. I mean, keeps you sane. But yeah, with this particular model, I was very strict in terms of interpreting all of the data that Carr had presented on top of all of the data that we had with what we have for skin impressions for the neck, on top of also kind of taking a nod to the gray literature, because the gray literature states that there was a Tarbosaurus specimen with very flappy skin. I didn't go as far with it as some artists did, because they were doing like full-on like mating call sacks and dewlaps. I was much more reserved with my interpretation of that, because I am still considering the fact that that is gray literature, so it's not testable yet. And the book that's from, I think, is from Indiana University. So I think it's a book on mating and eggs for dinosaurs. You can look that up. Mm-hmm. And we got all of this, and I kind of did this as sharp as I could get a Tyrannosaur portrait. And you were actually kind enough to send this off to Carr via, I think it was Twitter or an Insta Messenger.
No, it was, well, I mean, I sent him, prior to our interview session, I sent him via Facebook and email some of the stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it was, yeah, you were partially correct, actually. I didn't realize that by Messenger you actually meant Facebook. And
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I was expecting like a long laundry list of corrections, and all we got initially was this like exclamation like, yes! So I kind of just left it alone. I was like, okay, well, cool. And then the opportunity came when you did his actual interview to kind of delve more into, because I had that itch, and that's the thing about Paleo art. You always want to have the paleo itch to get things as close to accurate as you can, especially when you're being presented with something as monumentous as dinosaur skin that is shy of a dinosaur mummy, the end-all be-all in terms of solving your mystery as far as like what does a dinosaur look like. So we sent the chart in, and we have the interview on your YouTube channel, and he noted a lot of what sounds like very large changes. And it was funny because even when I redid the Tyrannosaur head in correlation to Carr's notes, a lot of these larger changes were actually very small, but they sounded huge. And I remember when I first showed it to everybody, you first hit me up like, what did you do? And I had to kind of clarify like, well, I did do a lot. It's just that it sounded like more than it actually was. And if you want to throw up the new art and then kind of flicker in between it, because it does take your eye a moment to kind of note the changes from one piece to the other piece. The largest change is obviously the skins, the big facial skin scales ended at kind of a certain midpoint of the jaw. Carr said, go ahead and throw that all the way into the entire jaw right up to the joint, which is the largest change and the most notable change. But there's a lot of tiny changes. There was pushing back the abductor muscle, which is that little web that you get between the upper jaw and the lower jaw. So that was pushed back. Which at first you don't really notice, because again, the first thing your eye sees is the giant face scales. And it's also a testament in terms of how reserved I am as a paleo artist when I'm doing a scientific piece, because I'm not going to go willy-nilly and just start throwing things on an animal that we have no basis for. I am very reserved on my approach in terms of getting the appropriate scales and the appropriate review. So I was too reserved with the facial scales. Carr said, throw more scales. We threw more scales. The next thing that was told was to bulk up the depressor mandibulae. So the depressor mandibulae, a depressor muscle is a certain type of muscle that does a certain type of motion. So the depressor for the mandible or mandibulae is that muscle reaching from the back of the skull along the ear, connecting to the joint of the mandible itself. So that was beefed up significantly in correlation to Carr. And then the final thing was to show the depression of the lateral and temporal fenestra, which is, if you look at a dinosaur skull, for guys that are just getting into paleo, you get like the 3 large holes in the skull, and only one of those holes are the eye. And you'd be surprised how many amateur kids, notably, and even adults that aren't really into paleo, mistake one of the fenestral openings for the eye. It's a very common mistake when you're just getting introduced to dinosaur skeletons. And then after a while, you start recognizing where the actual orbital process is, where the actual eye goes onto. But in this instance, the depression of the lateral and temporal fenestra is actually not as significant as you would see on D. horneri, which is consistent with what that reconstruction is on the Carr abstract, because that fenestral opening is more uniform. It's more ovular. There's more space to kind of get a more in-depth depression, versus if you're looking at Tyrannosaur skulls, which the specimens that I used for this reconstruction was we used the skeletal material for Sue, and then we used a lot of the mandible and the dentiary from Stan, who has, I think, the largest dentiary of any Tyrannosaur species yet. I say yet because it's always changing. And then we combine the two, but even if we even if we didn't use those skeletons, you see on Tyrannosaur skulls the fenestra, that opening between the lateral and temporal process, is actually more like an oblong C. So you would see a depression on the top, and then you would see a depression on the bottom close to the jugal, but you wouldn't see this open gap, because there's a piece of, like, right when they start fusing, there's a sheath of bone that just starts creeping its way into the skull. So that area starts getting more and more closed off. And that's something I think that's very distinct to Tyrannosaurus rex and Tarbosaurus, I think, are the 2 big Tyrannosaur specimens that showcase that unique caricature with the fenestra. So even in taking Carr's notes, I still went further into referencing the skeletal data to make sure that I was still getting a very distinct guidelines, being I took his corrections, but I was also sure to take those corrections into account with skeletal data for Tyrannosaurus rex, because this is actively a Tyrannosaurus rex reconstruction. It's not a Dasplatosaurus horneri reconstruction. It's not a Gorgosaurus reconstruction. This is a Tyrannosaurus rex reconstruction, which is why we aren't seeing the big pre-orbital horns sticking out of the head, or even the orbital process isn't showcasing these really elaborate horn ornamentations on the top of the skull. It's because we're being very disciplined with our reconstructions.
Yeah, of course. I mean, even if you look at the horneri anyway, one of the key points that me and Dr. Carr discussed in the first installment of the interview was the difference between these, crests or horns or whatever people call them, that in the Daspletosaurus torosus, they are actually larger than in a horneri. So horneri actually increases the overall, depth of the skull, but the crests actually downgraded in size. during their, this anagenesis transition that they described in Caratal 17 paper. So there is that as well. So it's actually fair to say that not all the Daspletosaurus actually even had these kind of pronounced crests. So one of the Daspletosaurus did, the other one did not.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing to take away from this, again, if you want to flicker in between both of the versions of the Tyrannosaur portrait, is that it's a discipline that you need to take when you do any kind of paleo art, if you want that paleo art to be considered scientifically accurate. You can do loosey-goosey paleo art, which is what I do a lot of the times. I do paleo art that just looks cool, and the subject just so happens to be dinosaurs, and I kind of get more playful with the ornamentation or the skin, or add things that might not have been there, but we don't have evidence against it, so there you go. But
a very like this is the very reason that when it gets brought up, it almost gives me an allergic reaction, but I don't want to get into that.
Yes, but that goes into my discipline, because if someone gives me that art and says, well, is this scientifically accurate, I will be completely transparent and tell them this is a very loose representation of what we are seeing with science, but this isn't a step-by-step scientific recreation, versus this Tyrannosaur portrait is a very specific step-by-step skeletal and flesh recreation, because we went through all the proper channels. I referenced all the material. I took abstracts into account, and then I even had a Tyrannosaur expert that was gracious enough to give me the time of day. Thanks again, Mr. Carr. You're an awesome guy.
He's a doctor, not a mister.
Oh, well, Mr. Doctor, the whole Doctor Strange, Mr. Doctor.
I'm telling you, we're very picky here on this channel, so we're savage here. We don't take mistakes for granted.
I love it. But Professor Carr.
Well, hopefully one day he will get awarded the title as well. We'll never know, because he's working on a very good publication right now, which I'm absolutely dying to find out what's going to happen, because there's going to be a lot of stuff.
All of us are. Yeah, no, I think we're all dying about. He told us about it in the last interview, and that's just going to be a whopper of paleontological gold. But and it has to do with Tyrannosaurs.
Oh yes, so, of course. I mean, why? What else could it possibly to do with? I mean, come on, let's think.
Yeah, he's a Tyrannosaur expert. If it was on pterosaurs, I'd be way surprised. But no, it's on Tyrannosaurs. But but yeah, no, it showcases the not only the artistic discipline, but the academic discipline that has to be implemented whenever you do any kind of scientific reconstruction for a science paper, or even a science blog, if people insist that their blogs be considered citable means of refuting a theory or rebutting an abstract or a paper. If you're going to cite a blog or a YouTube video or something of that nature, then you will have to go through the same disciplines. And that's what we're doing here. We're going through those same disciplines, so people can reference our recreations and our data and say, like, yeah, these guys went through the proper channels. They reference the proper data. They are not doing anything that is counterintuitive to the evidence that has been discovered. And then there's another discipline that most paleo artists hate to recognize, and that is paleo art is always changing. There is never going to be the absolutist definition of a dinosaur recreation unless we get a super 99% fully preserved with skin and color dinosaur mummy or a time machine. Because paleo art, just as paleontology, is always evolving. We're always having to change things as we discover more and more fossils. That's why I even put in the description of this particular drawing on my art site that it is the most current Tyrannosaur, most accurate Tyrannosaur reconstruction that I have done so far. Meaning that yes, I will probably, or somebody will probably find something down the road that changes the picture completely in another direction. And we will have to course correct as needed. But the thing is, if you want to be taken seriously as a paleo artist, your job is not to fight and complain and kind of fight against the grain when these changes come. But your job is to actually course correct and implement those changes and change your art if you want to keep your status as a scientifically accurate paleo artist. And I think that's a standard that a lot of us need to implement more, because I think it's something that's been lost in paleo art within the last couple of years, being like random speculation and, you know, just kind of filling in the blanks to be trendy or shocking or to be talked about. It works because people are talking about you, but that does not translate into it being scientifically accurate.
No, it does not.
That just that just means you're making a large show just for personal, just for personal attention. I could have drew this T-Rex with fins and, a Komodo dragon tongue and some kind of weird horns coming out of its head and cited a bunch of scientific papers. And I would have been getting the attention I wanted, definitely. But that doesn't mean that it would have been, one, good attention, and two, it would not have been scientifically accurate. Even if I was like just tagging paleo papers, it would not have justified the changes I was making on that piece. So yeah, there's a certain discipline that I think should start getting implemented with paleo art that is meant to be scientifically accurate.
Don't worry, Josh. I mean, you can always, at the end of the day, put in a line there somewhere in between more lines saying, that, oh, we don't have any evidence that disproves the, presence of the varanid or whatever lizard tongue or the huge osteodermic horns or whatever it is you want to put in there. So, I'm just gonna put it there because why not?
Yeah, exactly. That's not the way.
It is not the way it works.
That's not the way that's not the way academia works at all. That's not the way paleo reconstruction should work at all. And I think that needs to be addressed in a larger aspect in paleo art down the road, because there is also there's also a good and a bad way to present it. If you just rub someone the wrong way with your initial critique, that can actually do way more damage than, being more diplomatic with your approach when you're doing a critique of somebody who's done a scientific reconstruction. You've seen me kind of address scientific reconstructions that are kind of very off the target. But I'm always very diplomatic in suggesting, hey, maybe you want to do this, maybe you want to do that. I offer research papers. That's another thing Paleo World does, is we have a very large academic library at our disposal, and it's a part of the re-education process. I'm here to educate these people that are trying to break into paleo art, and the only way to do that is to offer them these papers. Like, here's the paper. If you don't want to use our chart, don't use our chart. That's fine. But here are the papers, and you can come to your own conclusions. But at least I did my part to give you the papers. And if you choose to ignore the papers, that's your prerogative. But now you are ignoring the science at the same time. And that is what's going to separate you from a scientific paleo artist to just a person that just does dinosaur art.
Yeah, that's also one of the other things I wanted to add, is that you have to make it very clear and understandable that when you're criticizing someone's work, you're not trying to hurt them. You're trying to give them clues and directions into where they were wrong, Of course, you can be wrong about showing where they were wrong. That's also possible. It happens, a lot of times to everybody, I'm sure. There were times when I had, when I discussed certain pieces and I believed something, like before I started actually doing all the detailed research based on the scientific evidence. I was, let's just say I wasn't doing as disciplined research as I believe now it should have been done. And I realized that I was wrong, and that's okay, because sometimes those who criticize can be wrong, and those who are being criticized are also could be wrong. In which case, there's two ways to go about it. Whichever way you go about it, it shouldn't hurt the other person, right? It should, because you're not trying to hurt them. So what it is you do is either you be diplomatic, like you, or like me, you end them rightly so they feel no pain.
Yeah, exactly. Which I mean, there's instances even where someone can come off like a complete jerk, and I'm keeping it PG here because dinosaurs and paleo art, it's cool stuff. Kids are gonna watch this. So I'm trying my best to be kid friendly. But someone did come off as a complete jerk during one reconstruction that I did. Because I didn't do the discipline research I did, but it was meant to be kind of a very loose paleo piece, and it had to deal with Tyrannosaurs and bear dogs. And technically they both are in the same era. But when I posted the piece, someone did a very rude, very undisciplined, almost unnecessary, like they didn't even critique it. They just kind of went off and what the censored is this, and that's not constructive in any way. That did not set me off in the right mood when I'm eager to share and get some intellectual thought. That is not the intellectual thought I'm expecting. But what it did do was set a fire under me to kind of prove this guy wrong. And I did. And I did a lot of research and I did a lot of digging. And I did find an instance in Mongolia where we do have large Titanotheres or Brontotheres, and specifically Embolotherium, in the same formation with large bear dogs in terms of, I'm probably going to butcher this name, but Yacendria, I believe is the species, but Yacendria was around the same size as Amphicyon, which Amphicyon is like the big giant bear dog that we get here in I believe Death Valley in California, and you can find a mount of Amphicyon at the ALF Institute. They have one on display along with the tracks, which show that these tracks have giant claw marks, and that's already an indication that bear dogs had these giant bear claws on their paws. But it's an instance where, being a jerk to someone, I could have taken that two ways. I could have taken that as just mouthing off to the guy and kind of shutting down and kind of just internalizing all the rage monster and not being productive in any way. Or the other way, which is what I used it as an example to delve deeper into the research and actually find an instance where we have a large Embolotherium with a very large bear dog in Mongolia. So there's something to be taken from that for the people that feel like they are being attacked or they do get a lot of criticism. You can use that as a positive as a paleo artist just as much as you can use the positive as a paleo artist. And then finally, I would just say just be brutally honest with yourself if you want to be taken seriously as a paleo artist, not as a blogger, not as an Instagrammer, not as some kind of media guy, but as a serious paleo artist. You do need to be brutally honest with your reconstructions, and you do and should take a basic class in biology or biomechanics and start studying paleontology papers, because it's only because of these paleontology papers that I was able to get as far as I am with this Tyrannosaurus reconstruction.
Exactly. Like, the point is, you always try to remember that if you are being consistent with the known material and evidence, that means technically there is almost no, like, of course you allow some marginal kind of errors. There's always gonna be room for errors, so you can give, like, say, I don't know, for example, I was making a sculpture of this T-Rex, the mega awesome Tyrannosaurus resin kit, and that's what I use for my intro videos sometimes.
Still for sale, by the way.
Still for sale, by the way,
plug.
yes. Get your own. Get your own, damn it. I've got the links down below, so go ahead. For Christmas is coming short, you know, you gotta, you know what I'm saying? Get at it. Anyway,
Nothing says Christmas like a T-Rex, Arson.
exactly, yes. Nothing screams Christmas louder than a T-Rex, because Tyrannosaurus is awesome. And but my main point is that I was doing a 1:35 scale, and I found there is obviously this thing that we know that so far we don't have obviously any evidence from the body of Tyrannosaurida family that tells us that they would have any kind of larger osteoderms, which means I could not technically include them onto the reconstruction, because that would just basically me being embellishing it and you know, just doing what you said, the dinosaur art, because I'm adding a detail which contributes to what might be perceived as what the real animal would look like. And my purpose was not to do that. My purpose was to get the as much, you know, the closest possible look of the interpretation. I was also consulting Caratal 17. I also consulted Bellatal 17, and I came to the conclusion that, well, it's a bit problematic and hard to get the scale right, because you know how the scale entanglement on the body is so tiny that
Yes.
to represent it correctly, actually, to make it more accurate, you would probably need quite a large scale piece, as in like desktop piece, like maybe 1:15 or 1:5, 1:10 scale, like in that range. So 1:35 scale obviously is not going to give me that kind of interpretation, but I don't want it to be flat. I want it to have some sort of texture. So I gave it texture by using one of these, you know, like dental tools that I used as my, you know, source for the print. And although it would somehow maybe be an error, which means that I allowed myself that room for an error, but what I represent is information that is in the paper. So do you understand what I'm saying? That there's obviously a clear purpose shown to represent this specific information, although I purposefully allowed myself for this margin of the errors in terms of the scale, because of the limitations being given. Does it make sense?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I think yeah, I mean with the Tyrannosaur kit that you did, you interpreted that data well with the limitation, because there is a point where the animal, when you do a certain scale, these bumpy scales that are found on T-Rex that are similar to varanids. I think Carr cited that Komodo dragons were the closest common day contemporary example he could find. Komodo dragon skins on a Komodo dragon are very distinct. Komodo dragon skins on an animal that is 40 foot long that isn't scaled up, that becomes more of a micro texture, kind of like felt or some other kind of fabric, where you can visually see the micro texture, but the textures are so uniform that they kind of blend into this like just thing. And that's a hard thing to replicate. And I think with the limitations you did that accurately. But the fact of the matter is you are willing to talk about the shortcomings, and not shortcomings because of artistic license, but shortcomings just because of the physical tools that you had. Audio contamination. Hold on.
Shall we just go with it anyway? Because I don't think it's actually picking it up. So let's just carry on, ignore it.
Yeah, let's just go with it. But so if you hear music, that's me.
Just let's listen. Yeah, whatever. Music is fine. Music is good. So,
but yeah, with that's key in terms of what you're willing to address as an artist. So if a scientist were to address that to you as an artist, you could sit down and have a very polite and educated conversation, maybe even have a laugh, maybe even make a new friend about why the scales are like they are in your kit, but how they don't contradict anything that's scientifically out there. and that's because of the physical limitations of the material. But the fact of the matter is you as an artist are willing to address that. And what we're finding in the paleo art community is the opposite. We're finding artists that aren't willing to address that, or are barely starting to address that, but only after a year of kicking and screaming publicly versus calmly and collectively just sitting down, reading, and coming to the conclusions that we have come to. And I even said on my art page, if there was filaments found on Tyrannosaurus rex, I would have no problem putting filaments on Tyrannosaurus rex. The simple fact of the matter is that's not what the science is showing us. And as Carr has stated, we have to go by what the science is showing us. And right now the science is showing us on multiple Tyrannosaur specimens that scales are the null hypothesis. They are the current hypothesis that is a scientific standard going forward. But yeah, I mean, that kind of shows the attitude that I think needs a little bit of adjustment with paleo art. There's another Tyrannosaur piece that I sent you if you want to throw that art. And that is obviously a dinosaur fan piece. It's a T-Rex, and it's fighting off two Quetzalcoatlus. And there's a ceratopsian on the ground that's dead, so he's trying to defend his kill against these giant pterosaurs. And if you look at the skin on that T-Rex, there's big giant osteoderms, there's big head ornamentation, there's very large artistic licenses I took.
There's like huge teeth as well, and those things, like, they wouldn't just bite something. If you were to basically lie there, you know, across that middle part of the jawline, it makes me cringe to imagine what would happen. But if it were to go full power lockdown on you there, just clamp close these jaws, that would just not bite you in half, it would actually squash you because of how ridiculously thick and massive those teeth are.
It would shatter you.
It would just shatter
your
you to bits.
Shatter. Your bones would shatter. The blood in your body would probably spill out of your eyes just from the sheer pressure of it. So you would explode.
Talk about dinosaurs murdering humans.
Yeah, there's no better way to describe it. Exploding people.
Yep.
But I mean, if Carr were to come to me and tell me this is incorrect, I would not start kicking and screaming with them about, well, the possibilities of osteoderms is still there because we haven't not found it on T-Rex, and therefore we can make osteoderms and big old giant scoots on T-Rex until we find otherwise, even though we haven't found evidence of it. And that's not the correct way to do things. And that's not the way I would approach it, or else I would have done that with the Tyrannosaur, the first Tyrannosaur pass. I could have cringed at the amount of work that I would have had to do to make this correct. But the attitude, and I think the attitude that should be on most paleo artists, is one of excitement. You have a guy here who's the utmost authority on tyrannosaurs, and he's willing to take the time out of his day and his busy schedule, and he's making a giant codex of tyrannosaur specimens to chime in on your art. So instead of rewarding him with kicking and screaming, you might want to say thank you to these guys that are willing to take the time out of their day and, you know, take what they have to say to account, because these guys do know more than I do. I am not so headstrong to say, like, I am the absolute authority on my paleo art, ergo I work within scientific parameters, and if Curie and Carr tell me differently, I have enough loopholes that I am still going to be right. I am going to take their word, and I'm going to take their consideration, and I'm going to apply that to my paleo art, because I'm an amateur paleontologist, and these guys have PhDs in paleontology. So yeah, who's really wrong if they're not listening to who at that point? You got to kind of swallow your pride and take it like, hey, and that's just it too. It's never been an issue with pride of me. It's been an issue of excitement. Like when you and Carr were talking about my artwork, in car started noting all the things to change, I didn't start cringing. I got excited and I started taking notes because that's the attitude I have, which I think is the attitude most people should have when they do their paleo art and they are confident enough to submit that to review from a paleontologist.
Well, that's the thing to understand here is if you're gonna be completely blocked off with this huge wall to protect yourself, from being, criticized and addressed by professionals in this matter. And on one hand, you can of course continue living in this reality that you created yourself for yourself as well. So it's your own reality. It's reality that probably not many other people recognize. And just because somebody else, I'm not counting, I'm going by the statistical average example here because I'm not counting, people who are colorblind. But let's say if somebody tells me that, I don't know, my remote controller, which is black, is actually brown, I can say, okay, you're welcome to thinking that it's brown, but I can probably gather statistical data that would contradict that statement.
Yeah.
So, you're still welcome to think it's brown. You can still define your own way of brown. I am not going to attack you for it, but don't expect me to accept it. So,
yeah,
there is a difference.
No, and you brought up a good thing, which I think most paleo artists should take into effect. Carr used this great analogy of doghead when he was describing how most people like to recreate theropods in general, especially in Hollywood. He noted doghead.
That was the creature review we did, special bonus content for the Jurassic Park T-Rex, and he used the doghead example, which was, I found it both actually good and hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, no, it opened my eyes. I never even heard that term, and I've been doing Hollywood art for a while, so that's something I'm going to start sharing in Hollywood. But I mean, that's a good analogy for paleo artists. Paleo artists, you can consider yourself as having a dog vision, being we have a very limited spectrum of color that we see through. But if a human comes over via a paleontologist and tells us what you're seeing as violet is actually red, because you have a limited vision, because you have dog vision, you should not argue with the human who can see red. You should take into account that this guy who is seeing more spectrums of the color in the field of paleo is talking about something that he knows more about than you do. And so instead of saying what is violet, you now start need to addressing as red because you have a person who's much more educated in that field telling you that. And you would be at fault going against that. So yeah, I mean, if we take away anything from this, it's paleo artists do not get stuck into the tunnel vision that is the dog vision and ignore what paleontologists are telling you. If your goal is to do super scientifically accurate paleo art.
The thing I wanted to also point out, this is a very common pitfall that people seem to confuse. They think that just because, like, what you said is 100% correct, but it's important to understand the context. Like, we're talking about basically when a paleontologist, a scientist, basically a professional body within the field of paleontology, when they advise you, is how they advise you and what they do. We're talking about the statistical accepted, method when you refer to specific cited material, you refer to specific publication, specific work that's been done, and you're not just basically referring to, like, a lot of people I find that they mistaken this with something, but this guy said this, like, I don't have anything to cite for it, but he did say something about it, so therefore it must be true. So, you understand where the problem can come from? Like, if somebody basically takes it the wrong way, they're going to start breeding another misconception, which is quite common, unfortunately, as well, that it's just because somebody said something and because your methods may actually sometimes happen to be the correct method, while the professional might say, yeah, but whatever, but this, and they, you know what I'm saying? Like, you have to really also look at the methods that are being applied. So just knowing, that who is it coming from is not enough. It's good way to start because you obviously want to narrow down your source, and you want to make it as precise as possible. So once you obviously find your professional, you have to then start looking at what methods and techniques does this professional use, and how well do they specify the material that, and whether they cite any specific material when they are consulting you. I think this is a very important part, especially nowadays when more and more paleontologists are getting PhDs and they becoming, new professional bodies in the field. That it's important to understand the difference, that just because somebody said that they heard of a specimen of like Tyrannosaurus scales being present somewhere on a tail, that doesn't mean anything, because first of all, I haven't seen the specimen being photographed, so I can't replicate the observation. I have not been able to view the specimen in person. I have not seen any publications, peer-reviewed materials that confirm the specimen placement and describe it in very detail with the photographs and analysis. So therefore, believing it for granted just because a professional may have said something about its existence is not enough. It's because the problem, though, here is not because of the professional. The problem is the method.
Yeah, no, and that's a good thing to touch up on, because again, we're covering three bases, which again we can go back to the chart, and this is even in reference to the Tyrannosaur reconstruction that I did, which is we didn't stop at one methodology, which was taking one paleontologist's word for it. We got multiple paleontologists' word for it. And we didn't stop at just what we could find in terms of quotable statements. We actually made it a point to get in contact with these paleontologists and start talking to them about the specific thing that we had in question. And then not only did we stop at that methodology, then we started researching and hunting down the actual abstracts, the actual scientific papers. So there is a 1, 2, 3 step process that we're going through to get this outlandish quote, which for us the outlandish quote was all Tyrannosaur skin was the size of a quarter. So we got that quote and we put it through multiple paleontologists, and we got in contact with those paleontologists, and then we referenced the actual abstracts and the actual scientific papers. So there's a 1, 2, 3 process that happened to help us debunk this very loud verbal quote or soundbite, which was not true. And now we have all the evidence to say it's not true. And now we have all the visual papers to say it's not true. And now we have all the paleontologists correlating all that data to tell us this is not true. So yeah, no, there's definitely something to be said about not just getting sound bites from web forums or someone's Twitter or something of that nature, but actually going beyond that to verify what it is you're trying to prove. Verify what is the new outlandish claim in paleontology today. Oh, it's this? Okay, let me take that and go through the proper channels to make sure it's true or false, versus going up high on the rafters and preaching it to the masses when it could be just a misquote or a misunderstanding, or someone just read something in an abstract fast and did a very short summary of it when there's a lot more to it. So yeah, I mean, again, there's the casual paleo artists, which I just call them kind of dinosaur artists. And then there's the paleo artists themselves, which, I used scientific methods. There's a reconstruction of the Castroville and the foothill mammoth that is up, and that mammoth's name is Jimmy. And this was reviewed by the people at the Brea Tar Pits in terms of one of the hot things being debated right now at the tar pits and in general is the lack and or presence of fur for the Columbian mammoth species. And we kind of have instances where Columbian mammoths have no fur. They look very much like just very lanky elephants with mammoth tusks. And then we have the opposite end, where we have Columbian mammoths with fur, but not as much shag as you do find on a woolly mammoth. So I found a happy medium, and I presented that to one of the guys at the tar pits, and they were happy to say, like, yes, this is cool. This is a good medium to keep as an abstract, which is we settled on a mane and fur on the main extremities, so the chest and the back and the head, which is what you have to keep warm during the Ice Age. But we chose to keep the rest of the animal bare-skinned to help distinguish it from woolly mammoth, because most people don't even know there's more than one type of mammoth, let alone there's a Columbian mammoth and a woolly mammoth. However, here's the difference. If that same person from the La Brea tar pits or anywhere were to come to me and say, hey, we found a Columbian mammoth mummy and it's got fur, then it is my duty as a paleo artist to get that art and correct it according to that data. So that's the job of a paleo artist when they're doing art for paleontology, and their goal is to be scientifically accurate. It's to reflect the scientific data at the time, but also be able to be flexible, because like it or not, the field of art that you chose is going to be changing all the time. Again, until we find a time machine, that's just the way this field is going to be. We're going to constantly have paleontology theories pop up. We're going to have new paleontology finds, and it's extremely susceptible when you're trying to do something as vague as soft tissue preservation and things like hair or feathers or scales, or the presence and absence of feathers or scales or osteoderms or keratin sheathing. The list goes on and on. You know?
Well, yes, I mean, the other thing I wanted to point out here is we also need to be aware that it's not really a valid argument to say that just because, like, say you have only fragments on that skin chart that shows certain skins, it means that the rest of them would necessarily be different. Because paleontology, because I've had arguments a lot as well. I've been confronted now numerous times sometimes by the same person, no names again, but sometimes by other people too. And I honestly mean no disrespect, but I just really don't get the point of this kind of argument, because the rhetoric itself is flawed. You're basically saying that how can you assume that this is what they were, that they were fully scaly, or that they were fully feathered, filamented, whatever, quote unquote, or that they were fully hairy or bald, if you only have part of the picture. Well, we complete the picture because part of the paleontological process is about completing the missing pictures, because even if you look at the cladistic diagrams, have we not noticed enough how many of times have we changed them? I mean, we by like, I mean generally, not we as in us two, like sitting down, hey Josh,
Oh, yeah.
do you wanna like score this one out? No mate, you know, I'm just gonna put this one here. No, I mean like...
Yeah. Well, we'll just throw it on a wall and throw darts.
Yeah,
we'll
just like toss some darts on it, you know what I mean? Why not? So, yeah, this is what I mean. Like, paleontology is about filling in certain gaps, but the way we fill them in is we use the available evidence to give us the best available. So we're not trying, like, oh my goodness, like one example. Okay, the incorrect usage of extent phylogenetic bracketing, and to be short, EPB. This is one of the things that I cannot stress enough, and I thankfully we brought this up with Dr. Carr as well. He was kind enough to address this issue in detail when we were talking about reconstructing both the behavior and the phenotype of the animals. He made a very interesting point about by giving a very extreme example of if we were to use EPB and take it literally at face value without actually scrutinizing it, here is how it might go. Because the closest extent living archosaurs to dinosaurs are birds and crocodilians. So let's go from there. Birds can fly, therefore crocodilians can fly, and therefore dinosaurs can fly. Well, as vague as this term sounds, because not all birds can fly, but they still had wings, but they still cannot, some of them cannot fly, but then crocodilians, they do not have wings, and they obviously cannot fly. Then we have dinosaurs that had something that resembled wings and were probably able to glide, I would say, likely, not just a proper kind of, fully controlled flight, but perhaps some kind of gliding technique. But still, I don't really imagine a sauropod being able to take off the ground and fly. As fun as it would be to imagine, I do not think so. The other thing to understand here is that you use EPB where it's actually consistent, because this application of EPB is a classic and extreme example of how it is completely inconsistent with the known morphology and evidence. And I think people frequently misunderstand and underestimate the time difference between the periods. Like we frequently see people applying EPB without considering the process of natural selection. Quoting Dr. Tom Carr again, natural selection never sleeps.
Yeah.
It's a never-ending process. It's, you can't expect animals of different periods, which are separated by like 40 million or so years, to be the same.
No, you're right. And by the way, flying sauropods, that's the new plot for Jurassic World 3, I'm sure. But yeah, I'd say no, it's true, because you have the people misquoting EPB and not understanding exactly what EPB is, and just phylogenetic bracketing, not just evolutionary phylogenetic bracketing, phylogenetic bracketing. I had a person recently grossly misquote a basal understanding of phylogenetic bracketing. And this person also flaunted their PhD. And I was like, I don't know if you want to do that, buddy, because you got a very simple term incorrect. Yes, the terms do sound similar, but you do need to do the homework to get those terminologies correct. But here's the thing, though, that kind of highlights the gross misuse of this scientific methodology. And you need to understand that phylogenetic bracketing, evolutionary EPB, is susceptible to physical evidence. Physical evidence is not susceptible to EPB. EPB is a methodology that we use to fill in the gaps in absence of physical evidence. But once we get physical evidence, that doesn't mean that physical evidence is shoehorned into some preset model of EPB. So, and I mean, Thomas Carr elaborated on it way more delicately and way more educationally than I ever could. So I'm not going to build on top of that. But in terms of the layman's use of EPB, that's the way you take EPB. You use it as a gap filler when you don't have a fossil to fill in the gap.
And not a literal gap filler, which means that if you don't have certain part of the body, available, you don't just automatically assume that it would, or start imagining and fantasizing the possibility that it should have something different. Because, oh my goodness, so many times I heard, can you imagine if you bring up the skin chart again right here, just to give a context, can you imagine what would this Tyrannosaurid look like if we have all of the known specimens here as scales, right? Not bare skin, by the way, it's actually scales, which is big difference. And imagine if we had the rest of the stuff that is not known, all with filaments.
No, we would have a mangy Rex. I think that's been the
Yeah, I was
consensus.
gonna. Yeah, that's quite inconsistent, isn't it? Because you would expect
Yeah.
naturally that if you already have certain areas and collectively also not only like they are coming from variety of species that are also separated by quite a gap, in although they were all from later periods, but still these later periods where they came from respectively, they also separated from each other. They're not all, by all means, in fact, probably only a few of them, if at all, actually come from the same period. So,
Yeah, and I mean, just to play devil's advocate, let's just say that if you do want to vest your interest in, I believe it's the 2.3% against the
it's a
90.
2.6, I think.
Is it
I think so, yeah.
2.6? Okay, so 2.6 against 97.4%. So 97.4% of all tyrannosaurs within the family of Tyrannosauridae are scales, because we find more than one multiple member of Tyrannosaur with scales. So let's just say you pull in a win and that 2 point some odd percent gets you filaments. Those filaments are still very much limited to the dorsal side of the, I think like the upper shoulder area and along the spine. And even then, those filaments would be very sparse. So you're seeing the hairs that you would see not on the tail of an elephant, but on the body of an elephant, meaning you would not see them from a distance. And even then, for all these guys, because I think the one movie that everybody loves to hate currently in Paleoart is Jurassic Park.
Oh, yeah.
But if you want to use the 2.6% filament model of sparse hair on the abdomen and the dorsal side of a T-Rex, you are going to reference Crash McCreary's art for Jurassic Park, because Crash McCreary referenced elephant skin for a majority of those dinosaur models. So it's a very strange duality. But for all the people, yelling, anarchy against Jurassic Park, if you are emotionally vested in using the elephant skin sparse hair that you cannot see model for tyrannosaurs, just so you have the comfort of knowing that your tyrannosaur has filaments, you are still going to reference Jurassic Park, because Jurassic Park used elephant skin for their tyrannosaur art. And then you're still not going to see those filaments because they're so sparse. Like they're so thin and scattered, you're not going to see them at all. So I think a majority of these guys are going to swing the opposite direction and try to draw juvenile or tyrannosaur hatchlings with more downy feathers until we find a tyrannosaur embryo that may or may not confirm or give us an entirely different picture.
Well, that's another interesting point that Bellatal 17 addressed. They said that they always say that there were points where they said there is a possibility, there is a chance, but they also corrected it later, saying that, there is no evidence to support it. So at the moment, it's just nothing but a speculation. And speculations without evidence, they are just what they are, speculations. They are not used to be, they're not basically to be confused with the, actual scientific, factual, empirical evidence, which always comes first in every point. And
yeah. And I mean, again, to play devil's advocate, for the people that originally were putting feathers on Tyrannosaurus in light of the Eutyrannus discovery, they were justified. I will say they were justified because we had an animal at the time that was bracketed with the main family of Tyrannosaurs that were leading up to the development of Tyrannosaurus. We had the first large theropods showing extensive filamentation. So there were a lot of educated guesswork that was going into those initial reconstructions. Here's where it gets interesting. Now we have a scientific reset. So those same educated guesswork that justified feathered tyrannosaurs is now the same educated, not so much guesswork, but evidence that is doing the hard reset and giving us scaly tyrannosaurs. So the same methodology that justified the furry Tyrannosaurus in the beginning with Eutyrannus is now the same scientific justification that we're using to get scaly Tyrannosaurs because of the evidence that we found with the fossils, on top of the rebracketing both by the Bayesian and parsimony phylogenetic EBB methods for Eutyrannus, taking Eutyrannus out of the Tyrannosaur family lineage and putting it as a Proceratosaurid. So, yeah, I mean, we are getting two very different methodologies, but it's an example of how EPB is always subject to the fossil evidence, because EPB should have been subject to the fossil evidence when we found skin of Yrex, but we found no filaments. But that wasn't enough.
Or 2003.
Now we have
the Curie 2003.
Yeah, and that still wasn't enough. And now we have more than one Tyrannosaur with skin that shows scales. And even then, for some people, it's not enough. But there are some people that are finally starting to course correct as they are testing the data and subjecting it to tests and reviewing it, and they're getting the same results. So we do have people starting to address the weight of the fossil evidence and how that outweighs the gap filling method that is EPB. So that is happening, which is good.
Yeah, sorry, I almost I thought you were pausing there for a second. I wanted to cut in, but didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry if I kind of.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, basically, I wanted to also reach the conclusion of part 2, but by saying perhaps that we should really be more responsible for doing the correct assessment, like as in like not making sloppy bold claims and then expecting somebody to come along and correct us and point us in direction, because I find that's one of those things that people seem to like to do a lot lately. They just throw it out there, and when somebody actually does point out the problem, it's kind of, it just leads to a big, messy, unnecessary arguments, which I just think could have easily been avoided if the person making the claim could have just consulted the material better. So there's that kind of thing, like why go through the whole winter cold process if you could have easily just taken those extra vitamins and avoided the whole thing I mean, it's not like, yeah, it can be treated, but why go into treatment if you could have prevented it in the first place? That's what I'm kind of trying to say.
I'd say, again, a lot of these guys would benefit from just attending paleontology lectures, taking a crash course that goes into your Gen Ed or your GED in just biology, biomechanics, zoology, getting a better understanding of biology in general. And then if you're very serious about paleontology and you want to be taken seriously as a paleontology presence, doing paleontology and talking to paleontologists. And that includes reading papers that are sometimes 100 pages long. I suffer from the lost art of loving to read. And so when I get a paper that's that long, I always read. And I try to get as much of it from I can. Big papers don't scare me. But even if you don't like to read, that's kind of the sacrifice that you are doing to become more of a presence in paleontology and sharpening your paleontology savvy in terms of, getting new theories, interpreting new theories, especially if you're doing something as unstable as soft tissue reconstruction. Because, again, Tyrannosaur has changed looks for years until we started finding soft tissue preservation, and now we're in a great place. I feel like paleontology should be, or paleo artists should be more celebratory about the fact that we found so much Tyrannosaur skin across more than one animal. And it always struck me as a weird duality that there has been more fighting than celebration, when back in the early 90s or even the 80s, something as great as the dinosaur mummy was openly accepted with celebration. So maybe that's something that we need to get back to, not fighting the science, but just kind of celebrating the science, you know, like not really making internet or flame wars, but kind of unifying ourselves under the paleontology finds that are groundbreaking, addressing them for the groundbreaking science that they are. Because with our positive reaffirmation, we are dictating how the research goes. Museums are very much susceptible to public reaction to whatever new exhibit they put out or whatever new educational method they're trying to push, or how they're trying to present a detail or data. So, you know, just if we celebrate the findings of dinosaur mummies and dinosaur skin more, odds are pretty good we can influence museums to bring those specimens out to exhibits. And we can, as paleo artists, finally figure out, what did dinosaurs look like? That's the question. What did dinosaurs look like? And we are getting the answers. We just have to stop fighting the answers.
I say maybe start making these pubs and bars, you know, get them to make more money by, instead of fighting, you buy more drinks to each other.
Yeah, exactly. Buy the guy a drink, mellow him out, then have a talk. Yeah, it's good. It's a good method.
I will address this issue that you are kind of slowly leading up to in this next section, and I wanted to touch up final point on the paleo art section here, and just wanted to briefly comment on the work that you have mentioned earlier on about the more impressionistic and expressive sort of style that you have used, and I couldn't help but notice that this style in particular looks a lot like, sort of, if you were to basically take some of the medieval sort of Renaissance treatises, yeah, and enhance their images, that's what like it would look like, but the same way, but for dinosaurs or like mammals from the from the later period. So like it's basically like a combination of the medieval treatises, but you know, applying it to paleo art, but adding obviously a little bit of embellishment on it, because you know how the medieval treatises, they also, like, we know what the standard longsword is like. It's not a super cumbersome weapon. It's very, you know, hefty and everything. You know, it could be wielded easily. It was fairly light as well to a degree, although it's so misleading that people think it's like massive and cumbersome and you cannot lift it. That's absolute nonsense. And in the drawings in the art, they show them, you know, the small guy wielding this huge sword that is twice his size. So it's like, obviously there is a bit of an embellishment going on there, because we know that's not the reality, but as long as we understand it, it's well, that's what makes it fun. Like, we see the things that they're trying to do, because it's I think it's a very interesting note to make on some of your examples that I will show. So before we obviously let the viewers just listen to some of the, you know, whatever I'm gonna play next music, and just go through like a slideshow of these pieces to demonstrate the point, would you like to make a final comment on this series of work?
Yeah, no, depending on what you're throwing up, they will range from sketch pieces to fully digital art pieces. I think I have an instance where I'll do a very sophisticated sketch piece and then use that same sketch as the basis for the digital art. Yeah, you're right. The inspirations are classical paleontology art, so Charles Knight and Burien. I really honed in with that classical painted type of motif. So I try to reference a lot of brushstroke and canvas textures. And yeah, no, it's some pretty great stuff. The majority of it was done for Prehistoric Times magazine. So a shout out to Mike Fredericks and Prehistoric Times magazine. He's been my biggest supporter. And And yeah, depending on if there are any scientific institution pieces, some of them are at the Foothill Museum or the college, and a few more up north in Pacifica. Those are mainly for the mammoth pieces, and then we have the Tyrannosaur piece that's been reviewed by Carr, and then the rest is very impressionistic. There's one piece which should not be confused. One piece is from Robert Backer, which shows the Dimetrodon hunting a Xenocanthus. And that was included to show the colored piece, which is what I did, which was of Dimetrodon hunting Xenocanthus. And it was there to kind of highlight how you can take paleontology methodology and theories at the time, because Backer was showcasing this theory after a find they found in Texas. And he did a really great sketch piece, but I wanted to take that piece and push it further. So it was an example of how to take inspiration from your paleo artist and use it as a new paleontology piece without blatantly ripping off the original paleo artist, but also doing enough of an homage to the original artist, and in this case, the original paleontologist, that you know where the inspiration came from, which is Robert Backer and this find that he did. And then I took that and did something completely new, but was very much the same subject matter.
So basically, just to clarify for the viewers, the sketch, the black and white sketch we see with the Dimetrodon and whatever the name of this fish is, because I'm gonna butcher it, obviously, and that's basically Robert Backer's work, right?
Yes.
But and your counterpart of it that represents the same scene, basically, it represents the same content, but obviously the positioning is different, there's a coloring, there's a different technique, obviously, but the same creature, same period, same scene overall, but just slightly rearranged. That's your part here on a screen.
Yes, yes. So basically, I'm taking a well-known paleontologist who's an excellent artist, and I'm using that as an inspiration to do a completely different piece, a completely new piece. I actually did a sketch piece of this first, and then did a colorization. But if people are trying to figure out, well, where did this ideal of Dimetrodon hunting prehistoric sharks come from, they can look at this piece Robert Backer did and kind of fill in the gaps, like, oh, Josh did this not because he thought it was cool, even though it is cool, but because this is actually based off a well-known paleontologist's work, which is based off of a real paleontological find that they found in Texas.
Do we have citable material available? I'm pretty sure that even if you can't remember by heart, of course, we can look it up later, and as I edit the video, you should hopefully see it right here on a screen and link in the description. But if we don't find it, then consult Paleo World group, and we will hopefully be able, via combined effort from the crew members, to track it down for you.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I think it's a good time for us to say goodbye to the part 2 and let our viewers to listen to some relaxing or whatever dramatic, I haven't decided yet, music, and just enjoy all of these slideshow with your sketches and your colored work. Thingamajiggy. And at this point, we shall see you in part 3.